Before we begin this journey into the past, please take a quick second to subscribe if you want to see more history brought to life. The water turned red before it turned black. On the beach, 400,000 men stood in lines. They were perfectly still. They looked like statues carved from salt and fatigue, but the sky above them was alive. It screamed with the sound of engines. A German Stuka dive bomber tipped its nose down. The siren, known as the Jericho trumpet, began its wail. It was a sound designed to liquefy the bowels of anyone who heard it. The bomb detached. It fell in slow motion. It struck the mole, the long concrete breakwater where thousands of men were packed shoulder to shoulder. Concrete shattered. Bodies were thrown into the air like rag dolls. The wooden planks vanished in a cloud of splinters and smoke. And yet, when the smoke cleared, the men in the back of the line simply stepped forward. They closed the gap. They did not run. They had nowhere to run. This was the end of the world. It was May 1940. The location was Dunkirk, a small coastal town in France. The entire British expeditionary force had been outmaneuvered. The German war machine, using their blitzkrieg tactic, had sliced through the Allied defenses like a scythe through dry wheat. They had pushed the Allies to the sea. Behind these men was the English Channel. In front of them were German panzer tanks. Above them was the Luftwaffe. Arthur knelt in the sand, his hand shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. The lighter wouldn't spark. His thumb was raw, but he kept flicking the wheel. It was a small, meaningless action to keep his mind from snapping. He looked down at his boots. They were sinking into the wet sand. He felt like the earth itself was trying to swallow him before the Germans did. According to a letter found later in a pocket, the waiting was worse than the dying. It read, "The hours stretch into days. We stand and wait for a ship that never comes. I have forgotten what silence sounds like." The air stank of cordite and burning oil. Black smoke rolled across the beach from the burning oil refineries in the town. It blotted out the sun. For a moment, it felt like night had fallen at noon. Arthur coughed, pulling his collar up over his nose. To his left, a young private named Eames was digging a hole in the sand with his bare hands. Eames wasn't digging a foxhole. He was just digging. "Eames," Arthur said. The boy didn't stop. "Eames, save your energy." Eames looked up. His eyes were wide, the pupils pinned by shock. "They're not coming, Artie," Eames whispered. "The Navy. They aren't coming." "They're coming," Arthur lied. "Just wait." Then the ground shook again. Not from a bomb this time, from artillery. The German guns were getting closer. They were tightening the noose. A shell landed in the dunes behind them, throwing a geyser of sand and metal into the air. A cluster of French soldiers near the blast disappeared in the flash. Arthur didn't flinch. He was too tired to flinch. He looked out at the water. The sea was empty. The few destroyers that had tried to come in earlier were burning on the horizon. The water at Dunkirk was too shallow. The big British naval ships couldn't get close to the beach. They had to send small whalers to ferry men out, 20 at a time. With 400,000 men waiting, the math was impossible. It would take a miracle, or it would take a massacre. Arthur closed his eyes. He remembered the words he had written in his diary that morning. "I can see the white cliffs of Dover on the other side. They look close enough to touch. It is cruel that home is so close, yet we are going to die here." The thirst was becoming a physical weight. Water supplies had been destroyed days ago. Men were drinking from puddles. Some were staring at the salt water of the channel with desperate, glazed eyes. Suddenly, a ripple of noise moved through the crowd. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was something else. It started at the water's edge and moved back toward the dunes. Arthur stood up. He shaded his eyes against the glare of the burning oil. "What is it?" Eames asked, standing up beside him. "I don't know," Arthur said. He squinted. On the horizon, the sea was moving. It wasn't a single ship. It looked like a swarm of insects on the surface of the water. Hundreds of dots. They were getting bigger. As they got closer, the shapes became clear. They weren't gray naval destroyers. They were white and blue and brown. There were fishing trawlers. There were pleasure yachts. There were tugboats. There were paddle steamers that usually carried tourists on the Thames. There were lifeboats. Some were so small, they looked like toys bobbing in the swell. A destroyer commander, looking through his binoculars from the bridge of his ship, couldn't believe his eyes. "What the hell is that?" he asked. His first officer lowered his own glasses. "That, sir," the officer said, "is England." The little ships had arrived. Operation Dynamo had called for civilians to lend their boats to the Navy. But the civilians didn't just lend them. They sailed them. Fishermen, bankers, dentists, and retired mechanics. They piloted their small crafts straight into a war zone. They sailed into the mouth of hell to fetch their boys. On the beach, the silence broke. A cheer went up. It was ragged and weak, but it was there. Arthur grabbed Eames by the shoulder. "Get up," Arthur said. "We have to swim." The boats couldn't beach. The tide was out. The men had to wade out to meet them. Arthur and Eames ran into the surf. The water was freezing. It shocked the breath out of them. They waded past the floating debris of war. Helmets, crates, bodies. They went deeper until the water was at their chests. Around them, hundreds of other men were doing the same. They formed human chains, holding hands to keep the weak from being swept away by the current. Arthur reached out and grabbed the gunwale of a small white motor yacht. It was named the Sundowner. It was a pristine pleasure cruiser, the kind used for weekend parties. Now it was covered in soot and crowded with soldiers. An old man in a thick wool sweater reached down. He had a pipe clamped between his teeth. "Grab on, son," the old man said. Arthur gripped the man's hand. The strength in the old man's grip was surprising. He hauled Arthur up onto the deck. Arthur flopped onto the polished wood, gasping for air. He rolled over and looked back at the water. "Eames!" he shouted. Eames was struggling. The current was pulling him sideways. He was too weak. His head dipped below the surface. Arthur lunged for the rail. "Grab my hand!" Eames surfaced, coughing, his eyes wild with panic. He reached up. Their fingers brushed. Then the water around Eames erupted. A German fighter plane swept low over the water, its machine guns tearing up the surface. Bullets stitched a line across the waves. It was a sound like a giant canvas ripping. "Wait!" Arthur froze. The water around Eames turned red. The boy's face went blank. He didn't scream. He just stopped fighting. The weight of his gear pulled him down. 1 second he was there. The next, he was gone. Arthur stared at the spot where his friend had been. "We have to go!" the captain shouted. The engine of the Sundowner roared. The boat lurched forward, turning sharply to avoid the strafing fire. Arthur slumped against the cabin wall. He was safe. He was on a boat. But he felt nothing. He looked around the deck. There were men everywhere, crammed into the cabin, lying on the roof, sitting on the prow. A boat designed for 20 people was carrying 100. The channel crossing was a nightmare of noise. Artillery shells fell around them, sending towers of water high into the air. The little boat rocked violently with every explosion. But the old man at the wheel just kept smoking his pipe. He steered through the chaos as if he were navigating a Sunday regatta. Arthur pulled his knees to his chest. He took out his diary. The pages were wet with seawater. He took a pencil stub from his pocket. His hand shook, but he wrote, "God help me. I am coming home, but I am leaving my soul in France." Hours later, the white cliffs appeared, real this time, not a hallucination. The harbor at Dover was jammed with boats, big ships, small ships, all returning with their cargo of living men. As the sundowner pulled toward the dock, Arthur stood up. He dreaded this moment. He expected shame. They were the army that ran away. They had left their tanks. They had left their guns. They had lost. Arthur braced himself for the boos of the crowd. He expected heads to be bowed in disgrace. The boat bumped against the tire bumpers of the dock. Arthur stepped off. He looked up at the people waiting on the pier. And he stopped. They weren't booing. They were cheering. Women were handing out tea and sandwiches through the chain-link fences. Men were clapping the soldiers on the back. "Well done, lads," a policeman said, helping Arthur onto the train platform. "Well done?" Arthur asked, his voice cracking. "We barely survived." "You came back," the policeman said. "That's enough." Arthur took the cup of tea. His hands were black with oil and dried blood. The china cup rattled against his teeth. He looked back toward the sea one last time. The horizon was still dark with smoke. According to official records, the British High Command hoped to save 45,000 men. They thought anything more was impossible. By the end of Operation Dynamo, they had saved 338,226. It was the greatest rescue in military history. It was a defeat, yes, but it was a defeat that allowed Britain to keep fighting. It was the miracle of Dunkirk. Arthur sat down on the train bench. The rhythm of the wheels on the track lulled him. Click, clack, click, clack. He closed his eyes. He could still hear the scream of the Stukas. He could still see Eames sinking into the dark water. He knew he would see that every night for the rest of his life. The train blew its whistle, a long, mournful sound that echoed across the English countryside. War creates heroes, but it also creates ghosts. And on that train, surrounded by saved men, Arthur was one of them. If you want to hear more forgotten stories of the people who lived through the darkest days of history, please subscribe. This channel exists to keep their voices alive.